It's now my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Stan Collins. Stan Collins has worked in the suicide prevention field for more than 2 decades, since losing a friend to suicide in high school. Understanding the value of restricting access to lethal means during times of crisis, also known as means safety, and its substantial evidence backing. Stan has led multiple programs towards such efforts. He currently is the lead on a statewide funded project for means safety, including an emphasis on firearm suicide prevention. Please help me welcome Stan Collins, speaking about plans for living, stigma reduction, and safety.
Wait, the previous presenter had a walkable microphone because I'd only been thinking. Is that all right? Okay. Sorry, that was like really arrogant way to start. I apologize. I just find that I'll end up walking around. So good morning, everyone. How are you?
Good morning.
See you all. Thanks for being here. I apologize for anybody that was here last year because there is going to be a little bit of repetition as far as mean safety and whatnot. But good morning. My name is Stan Collins. Thanks for having me. Looking at the list, I'm kind of surprised I got on the speakers list for today with all the degrees and stuff. So I apologize if I'm a little less formal in what I have to say. But I am going to be talking about mean safety. I want to start off by just acknowledging, you heard it briefly in my bio. I got involved in this work when I was around 17 years old after losing a friend to suicide. I am by no means only lost survivor or person who's been impacted by suicide. So we are attempt survivors, people with lived experience. So the most important thing I'm going to ask is just take care of yourself. We are going to be talking about mean safety. I will try to be as respectful as I can and avoid any activated content. But just throughout my talk and the talks today, just the most important thing we can do is make sure we take care of ourselves so that we can be here tomorrow to keep helping out. So one of the things that I wanted to start off by talking about before I get to the slides, I heard a quote, and I just found out about this guy, so I don't know if it's controversial or not, and I apologize if he is, but there was a French philosopher, Albert Camus, and he wrote one of the things that, as I was reading about him, one of his favorite quotes that I came across just a few days ago, he said, there is but one truly philosophical problem, and that is suicide. And so I think that's something that we forget when we talk about suicide. And it's great that we're hearing about more treatments and more treatment modalities and more medications and more screening tools and assessment tools. But I think it's important to remember that, because when I lost my friend Jesse to suicide when I was 14, I thought that suicide was about wanting to die. And therefore, suicide prevention must be about convincing people not to die. And it wasn't until I went through my own struggles and wondered whether or not I should be here tomorrow that I realized that suicide isn't about wanting to die, it's about not wanting to live. And that sounds like the same thing, but they're two very different sides of the same coin. But that means that suicide prevention is not about convincing people not to die. It's about helping people find their reasons for living. And if our whole goal is just to reduce suicides, we're never going to get there. We have to reduce the pain and suffering that people are experiencing and help them find that hope again and help them to find their reasons for living again. And I was speaking with Ellie Stout, who's the former director of the Suicide Prevention Resource Center earlier this week. And she used a term that I told her I was going to steal, so I'm doing this with permission. But she talked about the democratization of suicide prevention. And I think that's a really important part, because not everyone is going to see a mental health professional. Not everyone is going to be open to medications. Many people will never speak about their thoughts of suicide beyond their own intimate circle. They will never get connected. So we really have to get to a place where it's wonderful that we have more and more resources, but to be able to really empower the average person, to empower them to feel confident to sit in the mud with somebody on the nights when they don't know if they want to wake up. And I think that's a really important part of what we're talking about and what I'm going to be speaking to today around mean safety. And I also think it comes down to, I really appreciated the previous speakers and the acknowledgement of liability. I do a lot of work in the school setting, and unfortunately in the school setting and with youth especially, but I also come from family, law enforcement, I'm an EMT, so I've seen it from that perspective as well. So many of the decisions we make to quote unquote prevent suicide are because we don't want the liability to fall on us. We're so worried about this boogeyman of liability that we sometimes forget to stop and ask, what does this person actually need and what do they actually want? And we forget to make decisions. So I just appreciated that they did acknowledge that, yeah, liability enforcement does cause us to make decisions that we might not make otherwise. So my dream is that one day we'll have like a good Samaritan law for suicide prevention, and whatever your role is, if you're doing what you think is the best for that person, we'll have the freedom to do so. But anyways, I'll get off my soapbox and talk to you about what I'm supposed to talk to you about. So when we're talking about means safety, previously it was known as reducing or restricting access to lethal means. Now we kind of more collectively call it means safety. And this isn't just something I'm passionate about, but the Los Angeles County strategy, the state strategy, and the national strategy have identified that means safety is it's simply one of the most evidence-based effective ways that we can reduce suicides. And so I wanted to just give you context for that. One of the resources I'm going to keep pointing you back to, this is something we're really proud of. This launched officially last year, or went live last year, but we're launching it officially this September for Suicide Prevention Week and Suicide Prevention Month. It's called Striving for Safety. And what's unique about this website is we wanted to, again, democratize suicide prevention. And so when you look at means safety websites that are out there, most of them are for clinicians and for professionals. And there really isn't a lot of information out there for the average person who just brought their loved one to the hospital for a suicide attempt or for ideation about how do I make my environment safe? Or what if I'm the person who's having thoughts? What are steps that I can do to create safety? So that's what this website is intended for community members, their loved ones, themselves, but also for professionals at whatever level to be able to, a lot of the school counselors I work with say that they'll swing a chair around for the parent or the guardian and pull up the website, just walk them through the website. Say, hey, have you thought about this? Have you thought about taking these steps? Because we forget that the support and the caregivers are also in crisis now, and they're not thinking at 100% of their bandwidth, so we need to help them. So I'll be referring to this website, I'll get more to it in a second. And I forgot to start my timer, so I'll try to deduct 5 minutes or ish from that. All right, so just some general background on means safety. One of the terms that I really, I don't care for personally is the term suicidal. Because when we describe somebody as suicidal, that defines everything in their being. That is every part of their existence. And also it's kind of this, it makes it feel like it's this on-off switch. You either are suicidal or you're not suicidal. When in reality, when we talk to people with lived experience, we talk to attempt survivors, it fluctuates. It goes in and out. And there's some days where people don't have thoughts of suicide. There's some days where those thoughts are overwhelming. So I want to get away from that term, suicidal, and instead people experiencing thoughts of suicide or whatever way we can talk about it. As far as language goes, something else I wanted to mention, this is not to call anybody out, but I do a lot of work around messaging for suicide prevention. How we talk about suicide is really important. So if you're not familiar with this, I just want to introduce the suicide prevention community for the last decade or so has been trying to get away from the term commit suicide. There's clear connections to sin, to crime. We commit murder, we commit crime, we commit adultery, we commit a lot of negative things. Now, you also committed being here on Saturday, we commit to our relationship. So we do commit to positive things, but when we hear that term committed, we oftentimes go to a place of crime or sin. A lot of people are shocked to find out it used to be illegal to attempt suicide in California. A lot of faith institutions are starting to change the way they frame suicide, realizing that framing suicide as a sin doesn't stop it from happening, it stops people from asking for help. Like the Jesuit order, the Catholic Church, a few years back declassified suicide as a mortal sin because they wanted to remove that barrier from people talking about suicide. So another one that you'll hear is successful, unsuccessful, or failed attempts. If you break that down, if you fail an attempt, you're alive, and if you succeed, you're dead. So trying to get away from that as well and just refer to these either as deaths by suicide or attempted suicide. We're not trying to hide that suicide happened or suicide exists. We're just trying to break that association, that bias, stigma, and shame. So I just want to introduce that to those of you who haven't heard about it. And don't beat yourself up. It's going to take your brain a while to switch over, but we have to start thinking about suicide differently. And one thing that you can go and read all the research and Thomas Joyner's interpersonal theory of suicide, but one of the most consistent things that I have felt in my experience and the people around me is pain. we forget that suicide is not the problem. Suicide is what people perceive as their solution to their problem, but their pain, it's their pain that is the issue. And so I do a lot of trainings on the CSSRS that was mentioned earlier, but one of the most effective screenings that you can do is imagine this. Imagine I'm your 5-year-old nephew and I come up to you and I say, Auntie, Uncle, I got a tummy ache. What kind of questions would you ask me about the pain in my stomach? This is the interactive part, sorry. So where does it hurt? So describe the pain to me, what else? How long have you been experiencing this pain? What else?
What did you eat?
Okay, so what might have been causing this pain? What else? All right, so tell me about how else it feels. How about scale of 1 to 10, how bad is it? And when we think about suicide, we know that when pain is the driving reason, we know that when that pain comes more frequently, when it feels less controllable, that's when suicide risk elevates. But we also know from experiences and testimonials that suicide, again, is not this constant. It's not just this, I'm 100% all the time. Some days I'm at 60, some days I'm at 95. But we do know that most of those crises, even for somebody who for weeks, months, years thinks about suicide, those moments where that pain is so overwhelming that they're capable of suicide typically last about 30 to 90 minutes. And you've probably worked either with a patient or you've had a loved one come to you and at first they can't breathe, they can't talk, their eyes are just leaking. Within half hour, 45 minutes, they can breathe again. The world stops spinning a little bit, as fast. And I had this, I apologize if I told the story previously, but I was launching a firearm suicide prevention project a few years ago in San Diego. And so I was going into gun shops and seeing if they would share the materials. And I walked into this one gun shop. And for those of you who aren't part of the firearm community, a lot of gun shops, especially ones that are owned by kind of older populations, are almost like barber shops where people just kind of go and hang out and talk story. And I walked into this gun shop and there was this one like Clint Eastwood looking dude sitting on a stool over in the corner just glaring at me the whole time I was trying to get these materials. And I talked to the owner, he was really supportive, showed the materials. About a month later, I came back and the same Clint Eastwood looking dude was sitting there glaring at me. And as I was leaving this time, he said, hey, can I talk to you outside? I was like, oh my God. All right. So he takes me outside and he tells me, he's like, hey, I'm not sure if you remember me, but I was here last time you came in. I was like, oh yeah, I remember you. And he said, well, you came in and I heard everything you said about this and firearm suicide prevention, blah, blah, blah. And I thought you were an idiot. I was like, okay, thanks. And he said, and then a week later, my wife died. And I found myself there sitting with my firearm in my life. He said, and as hard as I tried to convince myself that you knew nothing about anything, I remember hearing you say something about 90 minutes, that usually the pain will subside in 90 minutes. And so I set a timer on my watch and I said, okay, in 90 minutes, if I still want it in my life, I'll do it. He said, sure enough, about 45 minutes later, the pain was just a little bit less. And after about 55, 60 minutes, the pain was a little bit less. He said, and then so I put down the gun and I called my friends. And so sometimes that's how suicide prevention happens. It's about giving people just a little bit of hope or a sense of control that maybe you won't always feel this way. And so again, it's important for us to remember that suicide is not just this static thing. I have to confess, I put my slides out of order, so this is gonna jump ahead and then jump back. But one of the reasons why we want to talk about firearm suicide prevention is some new research, a study came out, they looked at, I think it was over a 12-year period, hundreds of thousands of people. And what they found, we used to think that people own firearms for about 7 to 12 years before they would use them in a suicide attempt. And unfortunately, obviously with firearm suicide attempts are lethal majority of the time. But what the study actually found is that it was within the first year of ownership that over this 12-year period that most of these people were dying by suicide. So within the first 365 days of the 1,200 people who died over this 12-year period, half of them occurred in that first year. So first-time gun owners. And if you talk to folks and attempt survivors, people who have had suicide ideation, there's a seductive nature to suicide. And having access to such a lethal means can be really, it's almost like tempting for people. And so that's why when we say, okay, we'll keep your gun in a safe and keep it, keep the ammo separate and keep a gun lock or whatever steps, people say, well, what's the point? If I'm the one with the key to the gun lock and I'm the one with the combo to the safe and I'm the one who has access to the ammo, what's the point in that? Yeah, now instead of picking up a firearm and pulling the trigger, which is 2 actions, now you have to go get the key. Now you have to unlock the lock. Now you have to put the combo into the safe. Now you have to get the ammo and load the firearm. And so every little speed bump that we can put to build that time, to build that space between somebody and lethal means can save a life. One of the reasons why this is really important is that we know that during the last couple of years, during COVID, there was a huge increase in firearm sales. So there were a lot of people who went out and purchased firearms, but they couldn't go. We sold out of gun safes and gun locks. They were really hard to get to. People didn't have access to firearm instructors. And so we had this huge, delivery of firearms into the community, but we didn't have people who could learn about safety or how to keep those safe or steps. So this conversation about firearm suicide prevention is especially relevant with everything going on. Now, if mean safety is something that you're not really comfortable with, but you want to learn more, this website, meansmatters.org from the Harvard School of Public Health, really will just lay it out for you. It's a phenomenal website because it's got links to all the foundational pieces of research. So if you're new to this mean safety, I would really encourage you to start at this website and check it out. They really were the ones to push for mean safety in our communities. My slides are so out of order. I apologize. I probably should double check before I send them to you next year, Robert, if you ever have it back. Well, one of the things we wanted to do on our website is, again, knowing that most people have never heard of mean safety outside of our bubble. And so one of the things we created was a mean safety checklist. So this is downloadable as a PDF. We have some magnets that people can order. But again, if you know nothing and you're in a crisis because you're caring for somebody, what are the first 5, 10 things that I should do? And again, this is just a quick reference. It's not comprehensive, but it's just getting people to start thinking about, I think when we talk about those 72-hour goals that people get put on when, the crisis is imminent, we forget that not only is that 72 hours for that person to get stabilized, it's for the family and the caregivers to kind of catch their breath. And what can we do at home to prepare for taking our loved one back in? So that's one of the resources there as well. So when it comes to reducing access to lethal means, as I mentioned, we know that it's one of the most evidence-based strategies to prevent suicide. One of the things we don't always connect, though, is we think that the more lethal of a mean that somebody chooses, the greater their desire, the greater their intent is to die. And that's simply not always accurate. That's why when we look at attempt data, we see high numbers of suicide attempts in the hospital settings from drugs and overdoses or cuts and pierce. Fortunately, many of those are the lethality with that type style of attempt is pretty low, as opposed with firearms, which is why we have such a focus on. One of the things I think is really important, and we'll talk about this again in a second, is that again, people are not just suicidal and then they're suicidal forever. Most people who attempt will never attempt again. In fact, 70% of people and 90% of people who make an attempt will not go on to die by suicide in their lifetime. And that's why, again, having conversations about mean safety so that attempt isn't lethal and they have that opportunity for hope and resiliency and post-traumatic growth afterwards is such an important part. And we'll talk about this here in just a second, but a lot of people will talk about substitution, which I'm going to skip to right now. So the biggest pushback I get is, well, people will just find another way, right? Take away the gun, they're going to go get the pills, you take away the pills, you're going to go to the bridge, you put a barrier on the bridge, and blah, 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 and we kick the can down the road. But as I just said, if we can get people to either avoid or have a non-lethal attempt, they are unlikely to go through and find or substitute. And it's kind of I'll try to be careful with this one, but it's kind of activating. A Dr. Magadestis describes something called the suicide image. And so in terms of screening and assessment, we think of this as a plan. But when someone can start to see themselves and draw a picture in their mind of what suicide would look like with them, that's when they have this huge leap in capability. But once they start to draw that picture, they're kind of tied to that picture. It's a weird place to go in your head, but if we were to go around this room and say, okay, if you were to ever attempt suicide, what are the top 3 ways that you would, and what are the top 3 ways that you absolutely, there's no way you would go? And that list is going to be different for everybody. That comes back to us being comfortable as the caregivers, as supporters, and being like, how would you do it? And a lot of people are scared to ask that question because if their doctor asks them, well, do you have a plan for suicide? we think, oh, they're gonna think, I don't have a plan, so I need to go home and think of a plan. That's not what's going on. We need to figure out how far down the path, how drawn out is that image of suicide for? And we just need to be more comfortable with it. So you're thinking about suicide, that means we need to talk about suicide. And I have a buddy of mine who unfortunately, his mental health has floundered throughout his lifetime. He's thought about suicide. Every few months I get a call from him. And I'll sit there and he'll talk about, I was thinking about ending his life, I was thinking about suicide. And he recently reached out to me, this time not in crisis. And he told me, he said, you know what, just knowing that I can call you, to know that I have a friend who I can call who's not gonna freak out, press the red button, call the police, call the Lifeline, call a doctor, drag me to the emergency room, just knowing that I can call you and tell you that I'm thinking about suicide makes me less at risk for suicide. And sometimes we forget that sometimes it's just a little pressure valve, and that's what it is. All right, so what can we do as far as being safety? We can put people in a safer environment, we can put them in controlled environments. Unfortunately, there's no such thing as 100% suicide safe environment. I would argue that we can make people's environment safer. I might have said this last year, but one of the things I would love to see is a suicide safe section in Home Depot. Because you can go to a hospital and you can break away sinks and doorknobs and doors and shower curtains, but those aren't available to the public. But I know if I had a loved one who lived in my house, I'd go drop $500 at Home Depot so that I could swap out things and, but we're not there yet, but we'll get there. We can put barriers, safes, locks and whatnot, but the most important thing is gonna be that time and that space. So with that, I'm gonna skip around. So this is what the website actually looks like when you go to it, again, strivingforsafety.org. You're gonna see that we break it down by different categories of means and such. So we have a section for firearm safety, overdose, poisoning, suffocation, and strangulation, and kind of everything else, from signage to railways to parking structures even. We have guides on that. So in the firearm section, for example, similar to the overdose section, we have an area for individuals as well as for professionals. So for the retailers and ranges, we have a post-vention guide created by the AFSP that we link to. So if they do have a suicide in their facility, they can support their staff, support their customers. We also, there's a new law that CCW instructors, concealed carry instructors need to include an hour on mental health. So we're going to be posting a 1-hour training that they can use to talk about suicide prevention and firearm safety courses. And then in the home, what we're trying to do, and I'll talk more about this when we get to the materials, is give people their options around firearm means safety and what that means. All right, so the website was one big component of the contract I have with the Mental Health Services Oversight and Accountability Commission. The emphasis though is on firearm safety. So what we did is we created the website and now we're turning all of our attention to firearms and firearm suicide prevention. So we identified 5 pilot counties. We're going to be partnering with gun shops to not only passively display the materials, but actively distribute the materials every time there's a firearm sale. We put one of the flyers into the gun case, and also working with the CCW instructors like I talked about. One of the things we're really trying to push out in our firearm suicide prevention effort is a lot of people are unaware that we have what's called a safe, or what's referred to as a safe harbor law in California. So what that means, and Robert, I'm gonna pick on you because we're buddies. So Robert's worried about me. He says, Stan, I know you're going through a hard time, divorce, breakups, job loss, whatever. I also know you have firearms. Are you thinking about suicide? And if I were to say yes, and he's like, hey man, why don't you let me hold on to those? 5 years ago, that would have been a felony for him, and that would have been a felony for me. Now with the safe harbor law, what it does is it provides an exemption for friends or family to take temporary control of someone's firearms without any forms being filled out, without any legal issues, other than he has to not be prohibited. He needs to be legally allowed to own a firearm, so he has to have a permit, he needs to be able to store them safely. But that reduces so much of the fears and the barriers to people getting guns out of their home. Because what we typically have done in the past around firearm suicide prevention is we focused on storage at gun shops. And unfortunately, gun shops are less and less willing to store firearms for the cost of liability is going up, the cost to store them safely is going up. And perhaps the biggest barrier, if you're not aware, this year, gun shops now, if you store a firearm there, regardless of the reasons, whether you're getting deployed, whether you're going on vacation, once those guns are stored at a gun shop for more than 45 days, they have to add you to a registry. And for those of you who know gun owners, are gun owners, work with gun owners, nobody wants to be on a registry. So that has kind of eliminated gun shops in most situations. It's still possible, but so that's why our big emphasis of our materials is empowering people about the safe harbor law. Getting them to understand, what their rights are, and we'll talk more about that in the messaging. A couple of other things that we're kind of leaning on or pushing towards. So I mentioned the CCW course needs to include an hour, so we're really leaning into that. When we're working with any community, but especially the firearm community, who's the messenger? Who are they going to listen to about firearm safety the most? The firearm safety instructor. That's the person they're going to listen to. They don't need some suicide prevention dude coming in and talking at them. They need to listen to their instructor who says, hey, when we're talking about suicide deaths, or when we're talking about firearm deaths, we're talking about suicide. In California, over the last 5 years, more than 50% of firearm deaths are by suicide. So if we're talking about firearm safety, we need to be talking about suicide prevention. Right now, the firearm safety certificate test does have one question on suicide prevention. So we're working on changing that a little bit better. There's also a requirement that the packaging of firearms has to include the National Lifeline, but if you've ever seen the placard that's given out, it's like 0.02 font, it says it real small at the bottom. So we're making stickers to go and kind of match up with the flyers, try to build something in the firearm community. And also that the firearms dealers themselves are required to post the Lifeline. Most do have the Lifeline somewhere, but the law requires it actually has to be within 5 feet of the register or displayed prominently behind the register, and that's why we're hoping we can leverage them using our materials as well. So just a little bit about it. So there's some of the materials. We're going to have flyers, which actually I'm so bummed because my graphic designer had a hiccup, and so they just finished it last night, so I didn't have time to get to Kinko's, otherwise you would have been the first. For those who are going to LASPN on Tuesday, I'm there. As I mentioned, we're going to have stickers. These are just real basic. I'll show you kind of part of the images that we're doing. But just, hey, protect your rights, protect your mental health. Here's the Lifeline, and here's a QR code to get resources back to the website. We're going to have posters and that training content. So this is what it does look like. So you do at least get to see it. And what I want to do, actually, I was hoping we still got 14-ish. Does that include Q&A, or is that just me talking? I'm speaking? Okay, perfect. I can take a breath and just but this is what the materials look like, and I thought you might be interested to learn about some of the feedback that we got from folks as we were displaying. So we met with tons of groups, veteran groups, military groups, first responders, firearm owners, about what was the messaging that they wanted to see and what they wanted to hear. So one of the things as far as design goes is they wanted it to look sturdy. But the veteran groups that we talked to were sick and tired of seeing American flags and bald eagles because it was framing suicide as a veteran issue. They were tired, and this is their feedback, not my feedback. Because they felt like it was framing suicide as only a veteran issue. So while yes, we want to support our military and veterans, they said we don't want the bald eagle flying in front of the American flag and say prevent veteran suicide. But they did want it to look sturdy, so the color schemes kind of matched up with some other firearms materials. And I think on the next few slides, I zoom in. So one of the things is they wanted us to be direct. They wanted it to say suicide prevention. There's a lot of conflict right now in the firearm community. That a lot of people think that the term gun safety has been hijacked by the gun control community. And so many of the brochures previously created talk about firearm safety, and they kind of try to embed suicide prevention in there. And what we heard from gun owners is if I walk by a counter and I see a flyer that says what you need to know about gun safety, I'm not going to pick it up because I'm arrogant and I think I already know everything that I need to know about gun safety. It's kind of like what's the old saying, 90% of people think they're better drivers than everybody else out there. And not 90% of people can't be better drivers, especially where I'm from San Diego, especially here in LA. But so they wanted it to be direct, what we need to know. And what's interesting is they wanted these terms. They wanted protect, they wanted accountability, they wanted responsibility. What's interesting though, is when I talk to mental health professionals who work in firearm suicide prevention, work with these groups, they got scared by these words. They're like, don't call them out too much, don't tell them they need to be accountable or responsible. And the firearm owners are like, yeah, tell me, because I'm kind of a jerk sometimes. Tell me I need to be accountable. Tell me I need to not be so arrogant, and tell me that this is what I need to know about suicide prevention. And they also really like this idea of connecting rights to mental health. They wanted to, once we explained the safe harbor law or storage at gun shops, they really wanted us to help empower them to keep their gun rights. They don't want their gun rights taken away, but sometimes to make your rights safer, you have to remove those firearms or limit access to those firearms for a period of time. If you go to a mental health professional, and a lot of gun owners won't because they don't want their guns taken away, but if we explain to them, hey, if you go to the mental health professional, and I tell them, hey, Robert's already got my guns, and they see that I'm already taking steps towards safety, they're gonna see that I'm wanting to work on their team for my own safety, so empowering people about their rights. They also told us why, you gotta explain to us why we should care, so normally I'm not a big data person, but they really wanted to see these data points. They wanted to see that there's more firearm suicide deaths than any other type of firearm death in California. In fact, more than firearm homicides and accidental firearm deaths combined. They needed to get punched in the face a little bit by that data and say, oh, wow, okay, so when we're talking about gun safety, we really do need to be talking about suicide prevention. So here's a few more data points. So about a third of the suicide deaths in California were by firearm. It varies obviously by county. The more rural we get, the more that increases. This has actually got changed. We striked this quote because it kind of was a little bit off-putting to some folks. So we're leaning more on this language here. If you can read it as a firearm owner, it's your responsibility to be educated about suicide prevention. I'll read the bottom for you as well. As a responsible firearm owner, it's imperative that you're educated about the warning signs for suicide, how to talk to a friend or loved one, knowledgeable about crisis resources, and what steps to take to keep you and your loved ones safe. So they wanted us to tell them why they should care, and then they wanted us to, don't hide behind gun safety like I talk about, and then they wanted to know, okay, so what do I do? So that's the front, and then this is flipping over to the back. One of the things we did change as well on the front, I'm not sure if you noticed it, it said how to keep your guns in your mental health. We've actually moved over to this language here. People really like this one, protect your rights, protect your mental health. They thought it was more empowering. They wanted to explore this term of protector. And many people own a firearm because they want to protect their families. The statement here basically says, you're having thoughts of suicide, have access to a firearm. As a responsible firearm owner, you must acknowledge that the greatest risk to the wellness of your family is you. Take the steps to keep yourself and your loved ones safe. So they really wanted it to have that accountability. Like, oh yeah, well, I hold these to protect my family, but wait, if I die by suicide, I'm going to be detrimental to the wellness of my family. So they wanted to hear that type of language. Here we start to introduce this idea of adding time between thoughts of suicide. They really wanted this data point as well, the one we talked about earlier about people who attempt, if they survive that attempt, will not go on to die. They really wanted that power, those powerful statements. And then from here, we give them the steps on what to do. So temporary removal, they really wanted to know the actual penal code number because the firearm owners are diligent. They want to go research and make sure that I'm not full of it or the flyers, not BS. And then over here, what we wanted to do is start talking. And the goal and kind of what we're hoping to do with the firearm instructors is don't wait for a crisis. If you're reading this flyer, I want you to go talk to your circle of friends and say, hey, dude, I did not realize how many people die by firearm suicide every year. Can we make a promise that if I ever am having thoughts of suicide, will you hold my guns? And I want you to know that if you're ever having thoughts of suicide, that I will hold your hands. And so we can start to establish this so that the stigma and fear and those barriers aren't there when the crisis actually occurs. So this is a lot of the language that they wanted, and of course, referring back to life. So again, what we're doing differently, we're focusing on the safe harbor, we're focused on the protector mentality, we're focusing on accountability, that identify a buddy, that buddy system. I just think realistically, the most likely way that firearms get removed for a period of time, again, not permanently, is to have a friend come over and say, hey man, I think we should talk. Why don't I take it for a bit? And that person's, if you're gonna ask that person, they're gonna be part of your wellness team, right? They're gonna monitor you. There's other people that can come up with things, well, what happens if the person gives the gun back and now the person dies by suicide, and now they're liable? We gotta stop not doing things that might work because one bad thing might happen. So, and that may be totally wrong, but we'll see. I think that's all I have. That's my email address, stanpcollins@gmail.com. I'm going to talk a little story before we open it up for questions. It looks like I still got a few minutes, but stanpcollins@gmail is the email address. I should put the website up there again, strivingforsafety.org. I am not a crisis counselor. I'm actually the least educated, qualified person here today on the agenda, so I'm not a crisis counselor. If you are in crisis, do not send me an email. Anybody that knows me knows that I suck at email anyways. Please talk to one of these people, call the crisis line, go to your local urgent care. But I want to just close out. Robert, is it all right if I talk story? So some of you might have heard this last year. I'm not sure how much in depth I got in it, but so I've mentioned I've worked in suicide prevention actually since about 25 years, which is wild. I come from a family of law enforcement. My mother and my father are both retired cops. My brother's currently a sergeant with SDPD. So I've grown up around guns my whole life, and as I mentioned, I was the EMT for a while. San Diego Fire Rescue, the lifeguard division. But I've just always had them around. I like guns, and if people, for any of you who've never, just don't get why, or aside from the actual reasons, protection and safety and all those things. Like a lot of people, I just don't get why someone would want to go to the gun range and shoot a gun. Have you ever thrown a dart at a dartboard and wanted to be as accurate as possible? Have you ever shot hoops and wanted to make it in the basket? There's something that people are throwing a football and throwing that perfect pass. There's something about hitting a target that you aimed at. It's just, I don't know, I think it's a simple human level that's just kind of fun. So I don't know if I can explain it any better than that, but all that to say, a few years ago, I went through what my mom would describe as a rough patch. I went through a divorce a few years ago, had gone through some personal turmoil. Obviously, I work in a fairly, stressful, traumatic field of suicide prevention for a long time. And so even through the course of me being a supposed expert on mean safety, even me, being a go-to person to talk about suicide prevention, I found myself at a point where, and I had also just broken my leg, really badly broke it, and so I was on medications and dealing with all this heart stuff and mind stuff and everything. And I went out one night, kind of typical to the statement that was made earlier, substance abuse and suicide go hand in hand. I went out and had a couple too many drinks, and I came home, and this is it's embarrassing for me to say this out loud, and not because I'm embarrassed that I have thoughts of suicide, but how cliche the scenario was. I was listening to country music in front of my wood stove with a gun in my lap. It's the dumbest cliche ever. But as I sat there, that's all I could think about. And again, not that I want to die, I just don't want to be here tomorrow. That's all I could think about. And this damn country song came on by a guy named Charles Wesley Godwin, and he talks about, it doesn't really matter what he says, to be honest with you, but it caused me to take a breath and to realize how cliche and ridiculous this was, that I was sitting here. It just put the gun down. And now I didn't have a good strategy. I put the gun down, and then I figured, well, I'll just get drunk and pass out, and then I can't kill myself. But that was my strategy. And I got up the next day, and this is the most important part of the story. I got up the next day, and I went to my brother. And I told him what had happened the night before. Oh, man, sorry. I told him what had happened, and I was so scared about what he was going to say. My brother's been a dick to me my whole life. I was so worried about what he was going to say. And all he said was, I got you, I love you, of course. And that was the conversation. And then he was part of my team. And so a few months later, he said, hey, I think you're doing good. You want to go back to the range? And I said, yeah, let's do it. And it was as simple as that. And so sometimes it's those conversations, those little moments, and I kind of did napkin or tissue. I was crying in front of 100 people. This is so weird. Thanks for that. But again, I say this for a few reasons. One is sometimes that is suicide prevention. It's that conversation. It's being open. It's not just, we can't just put it on the helpers to be like, see the warning signs, have a conversation. We need to empower people to not be scared to say out loud, I'm thinking about ending my life. I'm thinking about suicide. So we have to focus more on that. But we also need to be more comfortable having conversations about suicide. In the firearm community, just acknowledge the lethality that firearms present. That is their intended purpose. So to be willing to do that, and I guess my final call to action would be to any of you. I was the suicide prevention expert. I couldn't say the words, I'm having thoughts of suicide out loud. So I encourage any of you to self-medicate by helping other people, to not be afraid to reach out yourselves, to have a conversation and say, I need help too. So with that, I'm gonna stop talking and crying, and then I'll take any questions. So thank you for listening.
Thank you for being so candid and open. Comment, you said that the church says now that suicide is not a sin. But I've had some patients say that the one thing that prevents them from committing suicide or trying is because it's a sin.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Wow. Just throw me a soft. To be clear, it's just the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church, so it's just one, but other faith institutions are going that way as well, and I think it can go either way. I think I absolutely know people who are like, I would never do that, I would never want to disappoint God, and that is their little speed bump, and that is their little time and space, because that's their gun lock or whatever, like their mental gun. But I've also heard people not reach out to their pastor or whoever who they would normally go to with other issues because they don't want God to be disappointed. So I think it can go either way. I'm just gonna through the middle element.
And I have a quick question, sorry, I should have given you the softball, but in this area, there's no softballs. You do these talks and stuff, when you were sitting there with the gun in your lap, in your room, did you ever have the thought, I'm gonna call someone to take my guns?
It wasn't until the next day. I knew that that's what I should do, but I also know that I probably should have done that weeks before, because it wasn't the first time. It was just the culmination of all the moments and just the complete chaos that happened on that day. It was just all culminated. So I knew for days leading up. I'm like, you tell people to store guns outside the home, never know it's a suicide. I think it was arrogance, honestly. I was like, well, I'm not actually going to. I'll just keep them there, I'll keep them there. I think there's probably a lot of people that feel that same way. Like, well, it's gonna be fine. So it really took me there. So did I think about reaching out that night? Strangely, no. I knew that I could, but again, I think this goes back to us being the helpers and that helper mentality. I would freak somebody out if I told them that the suicide prevention guy is thinking about suicide. That's just gonna crush, I don't know, break the world or something. So there was a lot of arrogance, I think.
Any other questions?
So I wanted to back.
Is assisted suicide still suicide? A good friend in August ended his life due to the diagnosis.
This kind of repeat from the previous session. I'm not scared. I'm a consultant, so I can say whatever I want. I'm not the hospital. So assisted suicide, when I was there that night, thinking about ending my life, I was making an uninformed decision about ending my life. I had not looked at all the different options in front of me. I had not even explored the other options in front of me. I think there's something that we're missing. Again, I kind of started with this about pain and suffering. Our goal is not just to reduce suicide, our goal has to be to reduce pain and suffering. Who am I to force, in my opinion, my personal opinion, who am I to force you to stay here just because I don't want it to hurt me? If you see it, as long as it's informed, as long as you've looked around, as long as you've seen if there's a cure for your physical ailments, as long as you check to see, are your physical ailments inhibiting your mental health, and you're not making an informed decision. So I'm not going to say I support it per se, but I would never judge somebody for making that decision as long as I hope they have the resources to look at it.
Hold on, we'll get you a microphone.
Okay. Okay.
Is it same thing for someone who says, I don't want to be alive? Or
Is it the same thing? Is it? I'm sorry, I'm not tracking.
I don't want to be alive?
Oh, is that the same thing as saying, thinking about suicide?
Yes,
For me, I think it's the same. I mean, it's very similar. I mean, I think, you know, like when you look at the CSSRS, like they ask for stuff, not wanting to be alive or wanting to go sleep and not wake up. And I think most people start there. Like, it's not that I want to die, it's that I don't think I want to be here. And that's usually a precursor to actual thoughts of suicide. And I'm pretty
is
close to
that where should be intervention?
Oh, absolutely, yeah, I mean, but again, I think that goes, our own intervention. That's when I first should have, the first time that I woke up and thought, I don't wanna be alive today, I should have talked to somebody. But I didn't, I waited, so there has to be more accountability. And that's what stigma reduction, all that is about, is giving people space to like, hey, whoa, I'm having a bad day. And this is the third bad day in a row, can we talk about it? So, that kind of answers. Was there a question that,
Yes, we're right there, and anybody you can.
First of all, I want to thank you. Your story was so powerful. I could actually leave now and I would, but I have a table and I want my units, but that was so powerful. I work in mental health
thank you.
and, no, thank you. I work in mental health, with a contracted agency for DMH. Our focus are adults 50 and older, and I want to say, the clients will talk about their suicide. None of the clinicians, and it's such a strong stigma on mental health clinicians. So I wish you would come and talk to DMH. So anyway, thank you.
I've heard that was speaking in the public. Thank you for that. When it comes to clinicians and stuff, like even after when I sought help, I was asked to screener when I called my insurance. I'm like, hey, I want to see a therapist. So they did put me through the screener. The biggest thing that I've learned, the biggest thing I train people on when doing the screening is the screening is actually the least important part. The biggest part of the screening process is building trust so that you get honest answers, so that I would feel comfortable telling you that yes, I'm not thinking about not being here anymore. So time in the report with it is huge. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Earlier in your presentation, you talked about how the rate of suicide related to firearms are greater in rural communities. I was wondering if you could talk about that a bit more, because from my experience growing up in an agricultural rural community, mental health are not two words that are ever spoken, and suicide is not really a word that's ever understood or spoken. And so I'm wondering about what your advocacy and education, specifically the language that you use to explain suicide as it relates to firearms, what that looks like for rural communities and people who really never interfaced with kind of this mental health language.
That's a great question, and as far as why we see more firearm suicides in rural communities, it's multifaceted. For one, there's greater gun ownership, typically less access to resources. There isn't a therapist within 5 miles. Even going to see a therapist who, if it's right next to the burger joint, like is somebody going to see me go in? That's going to be like, there's a little bit of anonymity that happens in this area like Los Angeles. Like I can go see somebody and nobody's gonna, do that. As far as how to introduce it, I think I don't have the answer to the bigger conversation, but I'm hoping that with these materials and this language that we're using, as far as not trying to take away your rights, we're actually trying to protect your rights, your firearm rights. I think a lot of people, even while having thoughts of suicide, we've seen this in some of the studies that firearms, specifically not binary, but males, well, yeah, I own guns and yeah, I'm having thoughts of suicide, but I'm not having any mental health issues. So there's some like a disassociation of, no, I don't have a mental illness. But I think it's about, when we talk about mental health, we really need to talk about mental wellness. I don't think we can talk about that, like, or when I work with first responders and military, we use the term mental fitness a lot more, because we talk about our physical fitness. Outside of our physical illnesses, we need to talk about mental fitness outside of this mental health. So I'm hoping that with this firearm stuff, we can at least get people to not be so afraid to maybe reach out. But I don't know if I had answered the rest. I'll let you know. So
We have time for 2 more questions. It looks like, oh, you have both of them online. Sorry. What is the prevalence of suicide in the prison system?
Prevalence of suicide in the prison system. I've done a minimal amount of work. I know that we do see significant rates in the prison institutions. I know we see, I think, where they always say that the prison system is the biggest provider of mental health services in America, so I don't know if that's accurate or true, but I'm gonna decline to answer that one because I just don't know.
And last question, how did you overcome the loss of your friend? What insight can you provide for people having what you experienced?
And it never goes away, it never like heals. It's just what you choose to do with the scar, I guess. And yeah, I think just holding space for that. I think the hardest part of the healing journey for me was allowing myself to not be sad about it anymore. Like to the first day that I wasn't sad. I remember like for months I just walked around just broken. And then I went through one day and I was laying in bed that night and I was like, what's weird? Something's weird. I can't figure out what's weird. I was like, oh, I didn't think about Jesse all day. And I felt so guilty. I was so mad at myself for not like spending my whole day like focused on his death and grieving his loss. I think the biggest thing for me, and when I work with other loss survivors, is remembering that they had a whole life up until that moment and they decided to end. So try to honor their life and who they were while they were here on this planet, not just the man. I think that's a good way to end it. To say thank you very much, sir, for coming.